The soft hum of the airport filled the air as Clara Reed made her way toward Gate 17, her steps light but purposeful across the polished floor. She was 28, with long, honey-brown hair pulled back into a simple braid, and a face fresh and luminous without a trace of heavy makeup. Clara's beauty wasn't the kind that demanded attention. It was the kind that revealed itself slowly in the grace of her movements, in the kindness of her blue-gray eyes. She wore a pale linen dress that fluttered around her knees and a thin, cream-colored cardigan, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows. Over her shoulder hung a well-worn leather satchel, the kind that spoke of years of use rather than fashion statements. She moved with an easy confidence, not the prideful kind, but the quiet certainty of someone at peace with herself. The first-class lounge sparkled ahead, a world of polished chrome, soft lighting, and the faint clink of crystal glasses. Businessmen in pressed suits and women draped in designer brands sipped their complimentary champagne, their conversations buzzing low and exclusive. Clara's entrance into this scene was like a soft note in a loud orchestra, noticed but not welcome. She felt the glances fall on her, subtle but sharp, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Who is she to walk among us? Her clothes were too simple, her hair too natural, her expression too open. She didn't wear the armor of wealth that the others displayed like badges of honor. At the boarding desk, she handed over her ticket with a polite smile. The attendant, a young man in a navy blazer and a practiced smile, took it with the faintest flicker of hesitation before scanning it. "First class, seat 2A, he confirmed, returning it to her. Clara thanked him and moved forward, feeling the weight of eyes at her back. She wasn't imagining it. A woman in a tailored ivory pantsuit nudged her companion, and he in turn gave Clara a look that was somewhere between amusement and pity. Clara kept her head high and her pace steady, refusing to let the moment touch her. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin gleamed with quiet luxury. Wide leather seats stretched out invitingly, each paired with a polished walnut table and a small reading lamp. Soft music floated through the air, a classical piece that made the world outside seem even farther away. Clara found her seat and carefully stowed her bag beneath it. She settled by the window, folding her cardigan over her lap, and allowed herself a small exhale. The sky beyond the glass was a deepening blue, the kind that promised a smooth flight, and maybe, if she was lucky, a chance to dream a little during the hours ahead. Around her, passengers continued to board, and Clara caught more glances sliding her way. A few passengers didn't bother to hide their curiosity or disdain. It wasn't loud or cruel, just the quiet exclusion of someone deemed not quite fitting. An older gentleman 2 rows ahead muttered something under his breath, causing his wife, draped in a string of heavy pearls, to chuckle softly. Clara pretended not to notice. She was used to being underestimated, and she had learned long ago that dignity didn't require acknowledgement from others to exist. It was something you carried with you, like a secret only you needed to know. As the flight attendants bustled past, offering pre-flight refreshments, Clara declined with a polite shake of her head. She retrieved a well-loved paperback from her bag and opened it on her lap, letting the printed words wrap around her like a familiar song. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a steward glance at her again, his expression shifting ever so slightly, from mild puzzlement to something more calculating. Clara ignored it. She had her place here, whether they understood it or not. Outside, the last rays of sunlight painted the tarmac gold, and somewhere in the distance, the engines of another plane rumbled to life. Clara closed her eyes briefly, breathing in the moment, unaware that the journey she thought would be ordinary was about to turn into something she, and everyone else around her, would never forget. The cabin door closed with a soft, final click, and the atmosphere inside the plane shifted almost imperceptibly. Flight attendants moved briskly down the aisles, checking seatbelts, offering hot towels, adjusting headrests, all with the efficient grace that spoke of countless flights before this one. Clara sat quietly, the worn paperback still open on her lap, her fingers lightly tracing the faded cover as she listened to the symphony of last-minute preparations. Her mind wandered to the reason for her trip, meeting her husband Jonathan in Austin for a quiet weekend, away from the noise of the city. It was a small thing, but one she had been looking forward to for weeks. Lost in these thoughts, she barely noticed the approach of one of the attendants, a tall young man named David, his navy uniform crisp and immaculate, his hair neatly combed, a clipboard tucked under one arm. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said with a smile that was too polite, too strained to be sincere. "May I see your boarding pass once again?" Clara blinked, surprised, but offered it without hesitation. David took it, glancing at it with a furrow of what looked like confusion, then turned it over in his hands as if searching for some hidden mark. She watched his mouth tighten just slightly before he smiled again. A little tighter this time. "Would you mind stepping into the galley area for just a moment?" he asked, his voice low and courteous, but firm in a way that allowed no refusal. Clara closed her book carefully, slipping it into her bag before rising. Heads turned subtly as she walked past the seated passengers, their interest thinly veiled under the guise of polite indifference. Some passengers shifted in their seats, some pretended not to notice, but a few exchanged glances that Clara caught in her periphery, glances heavy with assumptions and quick, silent judgment. In the narrow galley space between the first-class cabin and the cockpit, Clara stood facing David and a woman in a senior attendant's uniform, whose name tag read Stephanie. Stephanie gave her a professional smile that barely touched her eyes. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, Ms. Reed," Stephanie began smoothly, her voice oiled with a corporate politeness honed to mechanical perfection. "There appears to be a small issue with your seating assignment. It seems there might have been a system error. To avoid any disruption for our other guests, we would like to offer you a very comfortable seat in our business class cabin." Clara felt a flush creep into her cheeks, not from guilt or shame, but from the sudden, sharp sting of being quietly but unmistakably told that she did not belong. She glanced at David, who shifted awkwardly on his feet, his clipboard hugged tightly to his chest like a shield. "My boarding pass says seat 2A, Clara said quietly but firmly, her voice calm and unthreatening. "My husband booked it for me weeks ago." Stephanie's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened by a fraction. "Of course, we understand. It's just that, for the comfort and consistency of our cabin experience, we occasionally have to make adjustments. You would be very well taken care of in business class. We'd even offer you a complimentary amenity kit and a bottle of our finest wine." The way she said it, Clara understood that this was not a suggestion. It was a decision already made, wrapped in a silk ribbon of customer service jargon. She could accept and vanish quietly to business class, or she could make a scene, something Clara instinctively recoiled from. Still, something in her refused to bow so easily. "I would prefer to keep my assigned seat," Clara said simply, standing her ground without raising her voice, without making a spectacle. There was a slight pause, the kind that stretches into an awkward silence. Stephanie exchanged a glance with David, whose mouth tightened at the corners. Behind Clara, she could hear the faint murmur of passengers whispering across the first-class cabin. The collective awareness that something unusual was happening, though none of them dared to intrude openly. "I'm very sorry, Ms. Reed," Stephanie said again, the words brittle now beneath their polished surface. "But I must insist. If you would gather your belongings, we will assist you in relocating." Clara's hands clenched around the strap of her bag for a heartbeat before she exhaled slowly and nodded. She would not argue here, not in the confined space where every breath seemed loaded with judgment. She returned to her seat in silence, her face composed though her heart hammered a steady, painful rhythm against her ribs. She tucked her book back into her satchel, retrieved her light cardigan, and stood, feeling dozens of invisible threads pulling at her as the other passengers pretended not to watch. David opened a small service door leading onto a side stairwell connected to the jet bridge. Clara was ushered into the gray utilitarian stairwell, the hum of the engines vibrating faintly through the metal walls. Stephanie assured her once more that arrangements were being made and that she should wait just a few minutes while they confirmed the details. The door clicked shut behind her, and Clara was left alone in the cold, humming space, the smell of jet fuel faint in the air. She leaned lightly against the cool metal railing, closing her eyes for a brief moment, allowing herself a single breath of sorrow before steadying herself again. Her dignity was intact. Her purpose was unshaken, but something deep inside her, something old and wounded, ached at the familiarity of being pushed aside without a voice. She opened her eyes and stared at the narrow window that overlooked the vast expanse of the runway. The planes lined up in rows, sleek and indifferent, the machinery of travel grinding forward with or without her. Somewhere, far off at the edge of her hearing, a low rumble stirred the air, a sound that felt out of place, not belonging to the usual symphony of airport life. Clara straightened instinctively, her heart quickening not from fear but from a deep, inexplicable certainty that something was about to change. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Clara remained standing in the dim stairwell, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. No one came to update her, no one came to explain, and the distant drone of engines outside grew louder, then faded again as other planes took off without her. Every so often she could hear the muted sounds of movement behind the door, the shuffling of feet, the crackle of radios, the low murmur of voices. But none of it reached her directly. She shifted from foot to foot, feeling the cold metal railing dig into her back where she leaned against it. But she refused to sit down on the industrial concrete floor, unwilling to relinquish even that small shred of dignity. She adjusted the strap of her satchel across her shoulder and tried to focus on her breathing, slow and measured as the moments dragged by. Finally, after what must have been 25 or 30 minutes, the door opened with a hesitant squeak. A new figure appeared. A man in his early 40s with a close-cropped haircut and a dark gray security uniform. His name tag read Coleman. He held a small tablet in one hand and offered Clara a professionally detached smile. "Ms. Reed," he said in a tone meant to sound reassuring, but which only deepened the pit in her stomach. "Thank you for your patience. We just need to ask you a few questions to clear up the situation." Clara blinked, confused. "Questions?" she repeated, her voice even, though a thread of anxiety laced through it. "It's just a formality," Coleman assured her quickly. "Sometimes when there's a ticketing discrepancy, we need to verify a few things with the passenger before allowing reboarding." She wanted to believe him, but something about the way he avoided meeting her gaze, focusing instead on the screen in his hand-light, made her wary. Still, Clara nodded slowly and followed him down the stairwell, emerging into the bright, buzzing space of a service corridor. The contrast to the polished interiors of first class was stark. Exposed pipes ran along the ceiling, the floor was scuffed, and fluorescent lights flickered overhead with a faint buzz. Here, among the forgotten arteries of the airport, Clara felt the subtle but undeniable shift. She was no longer a valued guest. She was an inconvenience to be processed. Coleman led her into a small, nondescript office filled with outdated furniture and the faint scent of burnt coffee. Another uniformed officer, a woman this time, with dark hair pulled into a tight bun, waited inside, tapping away on a computer. Without looking up, she motioned for Clara to sit. Clara hesitated only a second before lowering herself into the hard plastic chair. "Name?" the woman asked crisply. "Clara Reed," she answered. "Date of birth?" "May 12th, 1995. The woman typed for a few seconds, frowning at her screen. Clara watched her, feeling as though she had suddenly been transformed into a problem to be solved, rather than a person. There was no accusation in the officer's tone, no open hostility, but the mechanical nature of the questioning, the way her humanity seemed to vanish under the cold fluorescent lights, stung more sharply than she would have expected. "We're having trouble locating your reservation in the system," the officer said finally, glancing briefly at Clara before returning to her screen. "Are you sure your ticket was booked correctly?" Clara opened her bag and retrieved the printed itinerary she had brought, just in case. She placed it carefully on the desk between them. "It was booked by my husband," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Jonathan Reed." The officer's eyebrows lifted slightly at the name, but she said nothing. She clicked a few more times, then leaned back in her chair. "We'll need to confirm with our corporate office," she said. "It might take a little while." Clara nodded again, even though a part of her screamed at the injustice of it all. She had done nothing wrong. Her seat had been properly assigned, her documents were in order, and yet she was the one sitting here like a suspect, her weekend slipping away minute by painful minute. Coleman stepped outside to make a call, and the woman at the desk turned her attention elsewhere, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts. She let her gaze wander around the drab office. The chipped paint, the cluttered filing cabinets, the faded posters about workplace safety pinned crookedly to the walls. This was not a place meant for anyone important. This was a place for handling mistakes, for shuffling away the unwanted. She leaned forward slightly, resting her arms on her knees, and stared down at the scuffed floor beneath her shoes. Her reflection stared back at her in the polished concrete. Small, quiet, out of place. A knot formed in her throat, thick and aching, but she swallowed it down fiercely. There would be no tears. Not here. Not for them. The door creaked open again, and Coleman returned, his face carefully neutral. He gave a slight nod to his colleague, who stood and grabbed a manila folder from a stack on a nearby shelf. "Miss Reed," Coleman said, "thank you again for your patience. Unfortunately, we're going to have to ask you to leave the secure area of the airport until we can fully resolve this situation. It's just a precaution. Standard protocol." Clara stood slowly, the weight of the moment settling over her shoulders like a heavy cloak. "And if I leave?" she asked, her voice low. "How will I get back to my flight?" Coleman hesitated for just a fraction of a second, long enough for Clara to see the truth written plainly across his face. "We'll call you," he said. The words rang hollow in the sterile air. Clara nodded once mechanically and followed him back through the service corridor, past the bustling staff who barely spared her a glance, back out into the public side of the terminal. They left her near a row of uncomfortable plastic chairs by a vending machine, surrounded by harried travelers and the distant crackle of boarding announcements. No ticket, no gate assignment, no clear path forward. As she sank onto one of the chairs, clutching her bag tightly against her side, Clara stared blankly ahead. Around her, life moved on without noticing. Families hugged goodbye. Businessmen shouted into their phones. Children chased each other around the pillars. The same world she had entered only an hour ago with lightness in her step now felt foreign and unwelcoming, a place where she no longer had a place. The hollow ache in her chest deepened, but she forced herself to sit tall, to smooth the fabric of her dress, to hold onto the dignity they had tried to strip from her. She would wait, she decided. She would not vanish, not like this. Not because they refused to see her. Outside the tall windows of the terminal, a faint vibration stirred the glass, and Clara turned her head, sensing a change in the rhythm of the airport. A distant shape was growing larger against the sky, sleek and purposeful, its spinning blades slicing the air with quiet authority. Without understanding exactly why, Clara felt the first real flicker of hope ignite deep within her chest. Something was coming, and this time, it was coming for her. The distant whir of blades grew louder, a steady, deep hum that vibrated through the glass and floor with a subtle insistence. Clara sat frozen, her fingers clenched around the worn leather strap of her satchel, her heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. The commotion began gradually, a handful of travelers looking up from their phones, a few pointing fingers toward the runway beyond the terminal windows. The general buzz of the airport shifted, curiosity rippling outward like a stone dropped into a still pond. Clara followed their gazes and saw it. A sleek, gleaming helicopter descending with a grace that made it seem almost unreal. Its brilliant white body catching the fading afternoon light. Its insignia subtle but distinct to those who knew where to look. The helicopter touched down at the far end of the runway, far from the usual flow of commercial traffic, stirring up small whirlwinds of dust and paper that spiraled briefly before falling still again. A lone ground vehicle zipped across the tarmac toward it, security personnel inside wearing expressions of tight, urgent professionalism. Whatever this was, it was not routine, and those watching could feel it in the way the air itself seemed to sharpen around them. Clara rose slowly to her feet, her body moving before her mind caught up, drawn as if by some invisible thread toward the nearest window. She pressed her hand lightly against the cool glass, not knowing what she was hoping for, only that something had shifted irreversibly in the invisible architecture of her day. The terminal speakers crackled overhead with a half-formed announcement, quickly overridden by a different voice, urgent and clipped, asking for immediate clearance on a private landing protocol. Gate agents abandoned their counters for a moment, gathering near the windows, faces puzzled and animated. Pilots and flight attendants standing nearby exchanged glances, some frowning, others murmuring among themselves. Across the hall, a boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing excitedly at the helicopter, but she hushed him, her eyes narrowing as she tried to understand what she was seeing. Clara's own breath came faster now, though she struggled to appear outwardly calm. Every instinct she possessed screamed that this moment was significant, that the slow, suffocating spiral she had been trapped in was about to break open. But how? Why? What force could reach into this indifferent machinery and pluck her from obscurity? Then she saw him. A figure emerged from the helicopter, tall and unmistakable even at a distance. Jonathan Reed moved across the tarmac with measured urgency, the kind of walk that did not rush, yet somehow conveyed absolute command. He wore a dark tailored coat that snapped lightly in the wind, his broad shoulders cutting a sharp silhouette against the pale concrete. His hair, usually so carefully ordered, was tousled by the descent, but he paid it no mind. His eyes, even from where she stood, seemed fixed on a single point. Her. A gasp went up from several bystanders as they recognized him. Not personally, but from magazines, from business profiles, from whispered rumors about the young mogul who rarely appeared in public without cause. Phones began to appear in hands. Tentative at first, then more confidently, but no one dared step forward. There was something about the way Jonathan carried himself that discouraged intrusion, a gravity that bent the space around him. The airport staff, until now brisk and self-assured, found themselves stammering apologies, stepping aside instinctively as Jonathan passed. One official, wearing a bright yellow safety vest, jogged clumsily to keep pace, speaking urgently into a walkie-talkie. Clara watched as her husband approached the side entrance nearest her, where a cluster of security guards waited awkwardly. Jonathan exchanged a few low words with them, too quiet to catch, and whatever authority they thought they had seemed to drain visibly from their postures. One by one, they stepped back. And then he was through the glass doors and into the terminal itself, striding toward her with a focus that made the crowded space between them feel irrelevant. Clara's knees almost gave way, not from fear or embarrassment, but from the sheer weight of emotion crashing over her. Relief, love, validation, a profound and dizzying gratitude that someone, somewhere, had refused to let the world erase her. Jonathan slowed only when he was a few feet away, reaching out to gently take her hand in his, grounding her, anchoring her as surely as the earth itself. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't need to. He looked into her eyes, read the day written there in invisible ink, and understood. Without a word, he pulled her close and pressed a kiss to her forehead, a gesture so intimate and protective that the bustling terminal seemed to blur and fade around them. The noise, the stares, the questions, all of it dissolved into the background hum of something unimportant. There was only the warmth of his hand on the small of her back, the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, meant only for her. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner," he said. "You should never have had to wait." Clara shook her head, unable to find her voice for a moment, overwhelmed by the simplicity and the enormity of what he had just given her. The quiet, unshakable confirmation that she mattered, that she was seen, that she was worthy not because of how she looked or where she sat, but simply because she was herself. Jonathan turned then, his arm still securely around her, and together they began to walk toward the nearest private exit, away from the staring eyes, the whispered speculations, the stunned disbelief that would ripple through the terminal for hours to come. Clara caught a glimpse of the faces they passed, some curious, some embarrassed, some openly awed. And for the first time all day, she felt no anger, no bitterness. She felt only a deep, steady pride, not in the wealth or power that surrounded her, but in the quiet strength that had carried her through the storm. As they neared the door, a young woman in an airline uniform stepped hesitantly into their path, her cheeks flushed with confusion and nerves. "Mr. Reed, sir, please, if you could give us just a moment, Jonathan's smile was polite but immovable. "Another time," he said simply, guiding Clara around her without slowing his pace. And just like that, they were gone, swallowed up by the dazzling afternoon light beyond the glass, leaving behind only the stunned silence of those who had watched and judged and assumed, now forced to confront the quiet truth they had so easily overlooked. The moment Jonathan and Clara stepped outside the terminal, the entire world seemed to shift. The heat of the afternoon pressed against their faces, but Clara barely noticed it. All she could focus on was the firm grasp of Jonathan's hand around hers, the steady certainty of his presence. They crossed the narrow stretch of tarmac, where a sleek black town car waited, its engine purring quietly, the chauffeur standing at perfect attention beside the open rear door. Clara had no time to wonder how he had orchestrated it all so quickly. She knew Jonathan. He was a man who moved mountains when necessary, and today, clearly, he had deemed it necessary. He helped her into the car without a word, following her in and shutting the door behind them with a soft, definitive click. Inside, the world was muted. Thick, tinted windows muffled the chaotic hum of the airport. The scent of leather and clean air conditioning wrapped around them like a private cocoon. For a moment, Clara simply sat there, trying to gather herself, but Jonathan leaned closer, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low but threaded with unmistakable steel. Clara shook her head slowly. "They said there was an error," she murmured. Then they said my seat wasn't available. Then they asked me to leave the secure area. She smiled faintly, a ghost of humor in her eyes. I suppose I didn't look the part. Jonathan's jaw tightened, and for a heartbeat, Clara saw the controlled fury simmering just beneath the surface. She laid her hand lightly over his, grounding him, reminding him with a touch that she was all right. Bruised perhaps, but unbroken. They treated you like you were nobody, he said quietly. And the simplicity of the statement, the sheer outrage layered into those few words, sent a rush of heat to Clara's throat. For years she had fought to keep her independence, to maintain her own identity separate from Jonathan's enormous shadow. But now, here, she was not ashamed to let him stand for her, to let his strength shield the dignity she had so carefully preserved on her own. The town car pulled away from the private exit, weaving around the perimeter of the airport grounds toward the secluded helicopter pad. In the distance, Clara could see the white helicopter still waiting, its blades spinning slowly now, idling like some great beast leashed and ready to spring. A small cluster of airport officials and airline executives had gathered nearby, summoned in frantic urgency once Jonathan's presence had been confirmed. They stood in tight knots, speaking in hurried tones, their faces tight with worry. As the car rolled to a stop, Jonathan opened his door and stepped out, drawing immediate attention from the assembled group. Clara followed, keeping close, her heart pounding, not with fear but with the strange, heady certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. She was not going to shrink herself to make anyone else comfortable today. Jonathan didn't raise his voice as he approached the group. He didn't need to. His presence alone commanded silence. The head of airport security, a broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard, stepped forward, clearing his throat. Mr. Reed, sir, I apologize for any inconvenience, he began, his voice oozing nervousness. There seems to have been some sort of misunderstanding regarding Mrs. Reed's boarding process. We're investigating it fully. Jonathan's gaze was steady, unblinking. A misunderstanding, he repeated, his tone flat. Yes, sir, a clerical issue, nothing intentional. Procedures, you understand? Jonathan cut him off with a slight lift of his hand, a gesture so imperious it froze the man mid-sentence. Procedures, Jonathan said softly, do not involve removing a woman from a secure area without cause. Procedures do not involve humiliating passengers based on appearances. Procedures, he continued, his voice growing colder with each word, do not involve treating my wife like an inconvenience. The executives shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uneasy glances. No one spoke. No one dared. Jonathan turned slightly, his gaze sweeping the group. You operate on assumptions, he said. You look at a woman dressed simply, and you assume she does not belong. You think value wears a label or sparkles under a diamond. You forget that real worth walks quietly. There was nothing theatrical about his anger. It was precise, controlled, devastating in its clarity. It exposed not only the personal offense against Clara, but the entire culture of casual judgment and exclusion that had allowed it to happen. The head of airport operations, a woman with silver-streaked hair and a smart navy suit, stepped forward now, her face flushed with shame. Mr. Reed, she said carefully, on behalf of the airport authority, I offer our sincerest apologies to Mrs. Reed. We take full responsibility for the actions of our staff. Clara stood a little straighter at Jonathan's side, feeling the shift in power, the subtle but profound reversal. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her silence was more powerful than any shouted triumph. Jonathan inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, but did not offer absolution. Change your procedures, he said simply, or find new leadership. Without waiting for a response, he turned back to Clara, his hand finding hers again, and together they crossed the short distance to the helicopter. The pilot, a man in a neat black uniform, stood respectfully at the base of the steps, saluting Jonathan with a nod before helping Clara aboard. The interior was sleek and quiet, the whir of the blades a low, comforting presence as they settled into their seats. As the helicopter rose into the sky, Clara looked down at the shrinking airport below, the runways crisscrossing like thin silver threads, the tiny figures scurrying along their designated paths, the glint of glass and metal catching the sunlight. It all seemed so small now, so insignificant compared to the vast sky opening around them. Jonathan leaned over and brushed a kiss against her temple. You, he said simply, are everything they could never see. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words settle deep into the spaces that had been bruised earlier that day. When she opened them again, the horizon stretched out before them, limitless and bright, and she knew without doubt that she had never needed their approval, never needed their permission. She had only ever needed the courage to be herself, and the strength to trust that being herself was more than enough. Below them, the airport faded into a blur, left behind with all its smallness and pettiness, while Clara and Jonathan soared higher toward a future defined not by appearances but by the quiet, steadfast light they carried between them. The helicopter cut through the air with effortless grace, carrying Clara and Jonathan away from the heavy, suffocating weight of the airport, and toward something lighter, something purer. Clara sat back against the cool leather of her seat, the low, rhythmic hum of the engines soothing the last edges of her frayed nerves. Jonathan's hand rested over hers, a quiet, steady reassurance that she was not alone, that she had never been alone. Through the wide panoramic window, the city unfolded below them, its towers and streets rendered small and harmless by altitude. From up here, the judgments, the whispered dismissals, the shallow glances seemed absurd, ridiculous in their insignificance. Clara closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself to savor the unfamiliar sensation of being lifted out of a world that had so often underestimated her. Beside her, Jonathan spoke softly into a private headset, issuing instructions she could only partially hear. His voice was calm but carried the unmistakable authority of a man used to moving invisible levers behind the scenes. When he ended the call, he turned to her with a smile that was part apology, part promise. "We're not going straight home," he said. "There's something I need to show you first." Clara arched an eyebrow in mild surprise but didn't ask questions. Trust, after all, was the foundation of everything between them. Within minutes, the helicopter began a slow descent, angling toward a wide stretch of land on the outskirts of the city where neat rows of new construction gleamed under the afternoon sun. As they touched down on a small private helipad bordered by freshly planted trees, Clara felt a flutter of curiosity stir within her. Jonathan helped her down, his hand warm and firm against her back, and together they crossed a short path toward a cluster of buildings still smelling faintly of fresh paint and sawdust. The place was beautiful in its simplicity. Low, modern structures with wide windows and clean lines, surrounded by gardens that promised future blooms. It wasn't until Clara caught sight of the sign near the main entrance that the breath caught in her throat. The Clara Reed Center for Arts and Education. She turned to Jonathan, her mouth opening in astonishment, but no words came. He watched her carefully, his expression softened by affection and pride. "I bought the land last year," he said quietly. "You always said you wanted a place where kids could learn, where people could create without judgment, without barriers. A place where what matters isn't what you wear or how much money you have, but who you are inside." Clara pressed a hand to her heart, feeling the emotions rising thick and fast in her chest. "Jonathan!" she breathed. But still the words faltered, overwhelmed by the enormity of what he had done. "You don't need their approval," he continued, stepping closer. "You never did. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. This..." He gestured around them, to the gardens, the classrooms, the art studios waiting to be filled with color and laughter and music. "This is yours, built not because you needed a pedestal, but because you deserved a home for your dreams." Tears blurred Clara's vision, but she didn't wipe them away. They weren't tears of defeat or sorrow. They were tears of fierce, uncontainable gratitude for this man who saw her so clearly, for the life they had built together without the need for applause or permission, for the simple, stunning truth that she had never been small, only unseen. Jonathan reached into his jacket and pulled out a small brass key on a delicate chain. He held it out to her, and she took it with trembling fingers, feeling the solid weight of it settle into her palm like a promise. Around them, the breeze stirred the young trees, and somewhere nearby, a bird lifted into the air with a sudden, joyous cry. For a long moment, they stood there in the golden afternoon light, saying nothing, needing no words. The silence between them was full and rich, a conversation deeper than speech. Clara slipped the key around her neck, feeling its cool metal settle against her skin. A new kind of armor, one built not of defense, but of absolute belonging. Finally, Jonathan broke the silence, his voice low and teasing. "Of course," he said. "If you prefer, we could always go back to the airport and demand a first-class apology." Clara laughed then. a bright, clear sound that made the garden seem to bloom ahead of schedule. She shook her head, wiping at her cheeks with the edge of her cardigan. "No," she said, her voice strong and sure. "Let them have their little kingdom of velvet ropes and polished shoes. I have better places to be." Together they walked the winding paths between the buildings, imagining the future that would unfold there. The students who would paint and dance and build, the music that would spill from open windows, the lives that would be changed not by judgment, but by possibility. Clara's heart expanded with every step, her earlier humiliation shrinking into a distant memory, insignificant against the vast, bright canvas before her. They paused at the threshold of the main building, and Clara turned one last time to look at the world beyond the gardens. The highways and skyscrapers, the glittering illusions of status and power that had seemed so important for a fleeting, fragile moment. She smiled, feeling a fierce tenderness for the woman she had been just hours ago. Scared, small, waiting by the vending machines with her worn leather satchel and her stubborn dignity. That woman had survived, and in surviving had become something even stronger. Jonathan opened the door for her, and as Clara stepped inside the cool, sunlit space, she knew with unshakable certainty that she had not been diminished by their blindness. She had been revealed by it. She had learned, perhaps for the first time, that her worth was not defined by where she sat on an airplane, or what others whispered about her behind manicured hands. Her worth was her own, as real and unchanging as the earth beneath her feet. Behind her, the doors swung shut with a soft, satisfying click, sealing the old world out. Ahead, endless halls of possibility waited to be filled with stories she had yet to write. And Clara, with her simple dress, her battered satchel, and the key that hung warm against her heart, was more than ready to begin. The following morning dawned soft and golden, spilling gentle light across the wide windows of the Clara Reed Center for Arts and Education. Clara stood by the open glass doors of the main hall, her bare feet cool against the polished wooden floor, a mug of steaming coffee cradled between her hands. Outside, the garden breathed in the new day, the young trees casting slender shadows across the paths, the air filled with the quiet, hopeful songs of waking birds. For a long moment, Clara simply stood there, letting the morning wash over her, anchoring herself in the peace she had so longed for without fully realizing it. The bitterness of the previous day, the cold indifference, the soft cruelties, all seemed distant now, like a story told in another life. Somewhere deep in the heart of the city, the airport bustled on without her. Planes taking off, passengers boarding, announcements crackling overhead. Somewhere, those who had judged her so easily were moving forward too, perhaps already forgetting the young woman with the simple linen dress and the quiet dignity who had stood her ground without shouting or pleading. And that was fine. Clara didn't need them to remember. The lesson had been hers, and it was more precious for its solitude. She had not been broken by their blindness. She had been sharpened by it, honed into something steadier, truer. Jonathan's footsteps sounded behind her, slow and familiar, and she turned with a smile as he approached, still barefoot himself, his hair tousled, a softness in his eyes that he showed only to her. He wrapped his arms around her, drawing her back against him, and together they stood, watching the garden come alive. No words were necessary. Their silence was full of understanding, of promises made and kept, of futures built on foundations invisible to the hurried world outside. Later, as the center officially opened its doors for the first time, Clara watched the first small group of children trickle in. Wide-eyed, shy, clutching sketchbooks and worn sneakers, faces lit with cautious hope. She knelt to greet them, to look them in the eye, to let them know without speaking that here they would be seen, not judged. Here they would matter not for what they wore or what they owned, but for who they dared to be. And as laughter echoed through the halls for the first time, Clara knew with a certainty as clear as the morning sky that she had never truly been dragged from anywhere that mattered. She had simply been carried a little closer to where she was always meant to belong,